Persistence of vision began through my passion for the history of Long Beach and wanting to see what Long Beach was like back in, say, well, in this case, 1929. I didn't know exactly when I wanted it to take place. I began doing research with no idea what the story would be, but knowing part of it would take place in Long Beach. So I did basically a year at the library with the microfilm, microfiche, going through the Los Angeles Times every day for a period of years to try and identify when I wanted it to take place. And I came to the conclusion that I wanted it to happen in 1929, but far enough ahead of the crash so that the crash is in it, in that the idea of noir is that there's a dark force, right? And for me, the dark force in my book became this thing that's not really in the book, the crash, which is drawing the characters towards it like a black hole in the event horizon. They aren't aware it's out there, but it kind of attenuated the color of the book in that no matter how happy things got, they always had to be kind of attenuated to this idea that in a couple of months the bottom's going to fall out. So, and again, none of that's in the book. That was all kind of helping me in my head as I wrote it. And the other part of it that was really inspiring to me was my love of old Hollywood. So thinking about the time period, part of that had to do with what was going on in the world of motion pictures and motion picture production at the time, which, I studied that in school, and I had a pretty good knowledge of the history of motion pictures, particularly in Hollywood. So I started pulling out ideas of having it have to do with Hollywood in some respect. Part of that came back to my family from an old photograph of my Uncle Joe. Joe Deeble was he sold insurance professionally, but he also was an inventor, and he was a performer. He was a member of the Magic Castle, and he did close-up magic. Close-up magic being that kind of magic that you do with simple objects like playing cards or coins, where you perform it in front of a person. There's no distance. They're right there. So Joe and his friend, a guy named Harry Buffum, who was of the Buffum's department stores family, were in Avalon on Catalina one day, and they were performing to kind of get a little money. And Stan Laurel saw them performing, and he loved them. He loved them so much, he invited them to come out to his yacht. And we have this picture of my Uncle Joe and Harry Buffum standing with Stan Laurel on his yacht. And the thing of it that really struck me, I think, is that Stan Laurel is wearing a yachting outfit like you've never seen him wear. The cap and the blazer, and I think he's wearing a turtleneck, kind of ribbed, corded, kind of like weave, and he just doesn't look like the guy that we see in the movies with the bowler. And now, which is funny, because one of the things I learned in working on this book was that Laurel was the brains behind the duo, and he was the writer and the director. And when they finished shooting for a day, Oliver Hardy would go to Riviera Country Club and try and get in 36 holes, and Stan Laurel would go back to the office, and he divided his time between writing their next project and editing the one that they were currently shooting. So his day really never ended until late at night. I had a passion for like Lon Chaney. I loved seeing the old films of Lon Chaney, and there was part of it was conscious, part of it was unconscious. I did not put them in the story just to put in famous people, because there's a connection between something about their upbringing, something about their family lives that ties together with my main character and the kind of craziness that he experienced growing up. So there's a resonance. So those two areas, the history of Long Beach and the idea of the film business, those were really part of where I came from with this. Knowing I wanted to write a detective story, all I really knew was it's going to be a private detective in Long Beach. That's my main character, private detective in Long Beach. So one weekend, after my year of research, I'm realizing, all right, well, I'm going to have to kind of get down to writing this book. My friends invited me to go out to Palm Desert for the weekend. I changed it to Palm Springs because historically it would have been, Palm Springs in 29. But we went out to this house that was owned by my friend's father. And he was a successful businessman who had been in, he worked for a company called Red Ken, which made hair care products that was acquired by Revlon. And he made a bunch of money and a seat on the board of directors from this transaction. Okay, so we go out to this beautiful house in this exclusive community for the Memorial Day weekend, and I began writing Saturday morning next to the pool. And by the end of the morning, I had completed the first chapter of the book, and my main character, the private detective from Long Beach, was dead. And I was like, okay, great, what have I done? What do I do now? And I thought, well, okay, tomorrow, come back out here by the pool, sit down, and start writing chapter 2, which I did. Now, funny thing is that what ended up happening was the house where we were, not the actual house, but the idea of that house and that neighborhood, it's in the book. It opens at that house. Only I describe it differently and made it the product of the French designer Le Corbusier. So the idea of the millionaire owning the house, who was trying to get a seat on the board of directors of MGM, came from my friend's dad, and that whole thing. I was just pulling stuff out of the air as I was writing, and it just started. And so we left that weekend, and I had 3 chapters written, and I continued writing for the next year and completed the first draft. And I have to say, it was as much a surprise to me how it went as it will be to anybody that reads it. I did not know where it was going. I didn't do an outline. The characters came out of my head. And it was almost as though I was reading a book and not writing it. So I was entertained. I was extremely entertained. After my ill-fated first chapter, when the character I thought was my main character died, the second chapter I sat down and started writing the second day. This character came driving in out of nowhere, had no idea who he was, Daniel Moretti. I don't know where the name came from. I really don't. It just came into my head while I was writing. And I described him driving in his DeSoto. So I just had this sense right away of who he was, what kind of car he had. I cut out a lot of that stuff because I learned, start in the middle of a scene. And so we did, I would say I cut the whole lead in, which was almost like a film, was like the establishing shot of a film with him driving to this house. I thought, well, okay, let's have him there already. So Moretti is a guy who he has quite a backstory, and that's been one of the challenges for me, is not just doing the historical research on 1929 and what was happening, but Moretti and a number of other characters in the book were veterans of World War I. So I had to learn about World War I. I had to do a lot of research on what battles were fought. The United States had a unique role in the war, in that we sort of replaced Russia when Russia stepped out because the war had broken their back economically and led to the revolution because the people were frustrated with having no resources. They revolted, and the Tsar and the family were killed, and Russia became the Soviet Union. So the United States sent the American Expeditionary Force to Europe, and it was essential that happened in order for the Allies to win. I don't know what would have happened if that hadn't happened. So he has the World War I background. But he also has a layer of background in that he emigrated to the United States when he was a very young child. He was the son of a man who was basically a criminal, who ran a criminal enterprise in New York City, and who used his son as a messenger, as a watch, a lookout. Daniel Moretti did not go to school. He didn't have benefit of an education. He learned how to read in the Army, in the AEF, because a sergeant befriended him and taught him using the manual, the operations manual. Here's how you read. So, and now, at this point in his life, he relishes the fact that he can read. but he's still, he's not like a Philip Marlowe college-educated guy. He doesn't have that level of intelligence. He has a different kind of intelligence. He has his gut, and his gut really is how he operates. So Moretti basically grew up in New York City, criminal father. Some bad things happened to him. One of the things that happened to him was his father hit him, threw him up against a wall, and he hit his head. And from that day forward, he was unable to see motion pictures. Now, I made this up, I thought. I'd never heard about this, but I thought, well, this kind of makes sense. The whole idea of how we see movies is this weird way that your brain works with your optic nerve and the frames being projected one at a time, 24 per second, that taking the still images and your brain kind of blurring them together in movement, this is how we see movies. Well, Moretti, because of the head injury, is unable to see that. So he basically looks at a screen and you just see a pulsing kind of strobing light. It was odd because after I wrote the book, I was talking to somebody about it and explaining to him, about this, and he said, "Oh yeah, my uncle had that." I said, "What? He said, "My uncle had that." I said, "How did he get it?" He hit his head. Okay, I guess I didn't really make that up, but so that's part of the idea. So that's persistence of vision, and that's where the title of the book comes from. And his inability to see movies comes into play because the crime scene at the beginning of the book, they find a reel of motion picture film hidden in the icebox. And so his first key piece of evidence to investigate the murder of this private detective, he's unable to see. And I thought that was kind of interesting at first, and then later realized, that kind of is how it is with a lot of forensic evidence, where like with blood, you can't look at blood and say, "Oh, that's type A," or he's a secretor. These are different factors that they're able to use to categorize blood. But you need a specialist to do that for you. And in an odd way, Moretti ends up using, for example, Charlie Chaplin as a specialist, because Chaplin has a projector. And so he goes to Chaplin and asks him, "Can you look at this film and tell me what's on it?" So they sit there and Chaplin describes to him what he's seeing, which is funny because as I wrote it, as I rewrote it, I started writing it more and more like Chaplin is becoming the director of the film that he's describing. And some of that is a little dicey, which it was funny to me to see how that turned out. When you're researching a project like this, it's critical that you go in depth. And my friend Rick Cleffel, he had a website called The Agony Column, which was about books, and he interviewed Guillermo del Toro, the filmmaker and author. And del Toro had a really funny thing. He commented about the internet. People who do their research exclusively on the internet, that is not sufficient. There's a lot of stuff out there. It's not curated. You need to make sure you can, like my rule of thumb is I got from the guys who did All the President's Men, 2 sources of attribution. You want to make sure what you're saying is true, is based on fact. Because there's a lot of stuff that's not true. It's like, the whole idea you can't believe everything you read in the newspaper. Well, apply that to the internet and multiply it by 10. So I did a couple of things. First, obviously I went to the library. I did research with the microfilm and the microfiche to get the general sense of what was 1929 like. Now, mind you, one of the things that came out of it, this is fascinating to me, and anybody that's doing research on a historical period, I recommend don't overlook the advertising, because there's stuff to be found in the advertisements that will tell you things about that period, about people, about how they see themselves, about how they see each other, that you won't necessarily get by reading articles. I found something doing the research through the LA Times that ended up becoming a key part of the book. And it was in an advertisement that when I read it, I thought, wait, that was a thing? And I thought about it. I thought, of course it was. We don't ever think about it today because we take it for granted. But at that time, this was a thing. And I'm putting this in my book, and I put it in the book, and it's significant. And all because I just stumbled across this advertisement. Other research I did, Historical Society. I looked through old photographs. They had archives filled with old photographs. A number of people have written books about Long Beach, and so they were able to fill in some of the gaps in the history that I didn't know. You know, my family came in 1910, but Long Beach had existed before that. What had changed? There was a club that's in the book, the Pacific Coast Club. My family were members of it. I never got to go. It was closed when I was growing up. Although a couple of friends of mine talked the real estate people into letting them see it by convincing them that they were going to potentially buy it, which was ridiculous. I can't believe anybody would have looked at these two high school kids and thought, oh yeah, they've got millions of dollars to buy this building. And unfortunately it was torn down. So there will never be anything that I get to see. So I have to kind of make it up too. But that was part of what I got out of the research, was I got to see it, I got to learn more about it, things that I had never been told by my family. So Pacific Coast Club, the Pike is huge, as I mentioned before. The Pike was a place back then that was known as the Coney Island of the West. It was so big and so popular among Southern Californians. That was where they went. And of course, back then we had the red car, which dropped them off right there. You know, the car would arc down off of Long Beach Boulevard, turn around and head back out Pacific. So that's the research was critical. And I didn't stop doing the research just because I was writing the book. There were things that would come up as I was writing, and I would think, oh, okay, you know what, I need to know more about that. And in some cases, it was stuff like basic things, like how did a car start? Different cars started different ways. So I need to understand how cars started then as opposed to now. And there were all kinds of things, like the icebox, you know, there were no refrigerators. This was early days of the refrigerator, and they still called them ice boxes, but it was now something that was cooled by electricity and not ice. So it was just endless, really. I mean, I was researching stuff right up till the end. Things having to do with how, here's one I picked up. There's a funeral for a Medal of Honor winner in the book. And I was thinking, 21 gun salute. Well, it turns out 21 gun salutes are not for no one other than the President of the United States. That I never realized it, but the number of rounds that they fire changes depending on who it is that they're honoring. So that was something that was interesting. The research was key, and it never stopped. So part of writing this book was learning how to write a novel. I'd never written a novel, so this was my learning. And as such, I did a lot of experimentation in terms of trying things. I made mistakes and had to correct them in some cases. But one of the experiments that I did was, I mentioned earlier about the backstory of the main character growing up in New York. I, at one point, wrote 4 chapters that left the plot line of the main story of my book, and it went to his childhood. So 4 chapters then were interposed into the book, which had detail about his childhood. It had detail about the immigration process through Ellis Island, which I learned from going there. It had detail about his father's criminal activities and things that happened to his mother. You know, his mother went through a horrible experience in a fire, again, based on real stuff. So by taking those chapters and putting them into the book so that it would all of a sudden go from, at the time, 1929, contemporary, to 1904, 08, you know, what I realized was I really liked what I had found in terms of the material that I developed in those chapters, but I didn't like what those chapters did, disrupting the flow of the book. And so after having written them and put them in, I went back and took them out. But they never really came out all the way. What I put in those chapters actually ended up enhancing what was in the book just by virtue of the fact that I had spent the time to develop that familiarity with those ideas and that research and the behaviors and all that. It ended up really helping the rest of the book, even though I took it out. It's still there. It is critical to have an editor. And, you know, editing involves, you know, on one level, writing and punctuation and grammar and that stuff. But on another level, it means validating information. I happen to have a friend who I've known since high school. We were on yearbook staff together and ended up going to UC Irvine together. Lisa has been working as a librarian at the library at UC Irvine since we graduated, and her major was grammar and rhetoric, okay? So she had a background academically of exactly what I needed somebody to do just on the nuts and bolts of, you know, did this sentence break? Is this correct? Am I misspeaking? Am I mangling the language? But beyond that, she had access to databases that the average person doesn't have access to. Let's put it that way. One day, I had seen when I was doing my research at the library something which is related to the persistence of vision and something that's in the book. A picture of the front page. It was the front page of the LA Times in 1929, in which Leland Stanford was announcing the 50th anniversary of the invention of the motion picture and claiming credit for the invention of the motion picture. He had made a bet back in the day with a guy who, the bet was that at some point all four horses' hooves leave the ground while a horse is running. Well, the way he won that bet was by hiring a photographer to come and photograph a horse running. And what he did was he set up a dozen cameras with tripwires, and that horse ran in front of those cameras, and every time it tripped a wire, the camera took a picture. So there were 12 photographs taken in succession, and they were able to see then all of the hooves leaving the ground at one time, and he won his bet. But then he claimed that was the first motion picture, which predated Edison and his research and development by decades. Well, I thought that was hysterical. So as I'd gone back and forth on the idea of calling the book Persistence of Vision and including this odd thing about the main character not being able to see movies, I finally committed. I'm going all in. It's called Persistence of Vision. I need to find this article. And so I went to Lisa, emailed her like, hey, do you think you might be able to find this? And it was in my inbox in 5 minutes, the picture of the front page of the LA Times with that article. And it's in the book. So Lisa was able to help me on multiple levels. And not just that, she was also really great in terms of encouragement. The fact that she loved this book really helped a lot. I remember the night she got to the end of the first act, and I got a text from her exclaiming her surprise at what happens. And I thought, okay, that worked. So invaluable assistance. It's funny, I had been writing screenplays, and when I started working on this book, I had not actively written a screenplay in a while, but I thought at one point about writing this as a screenplay. Having written a number of screenplays and had this experience where you talk about the different hats that you wear. I'm a writer, producer, director. I've done several short films. I've helped produce 2 feature films. I understand how to make movies to a degree, and when I write a script, up until recently, a few years ago, I would always end up looking at the script I was writing, and if I cared about it, and I mean I'm writing it, why that kind of means I care about it. I start thinking in the back of my mind, what would it be like to direct this? So the director's hat comes on, and I start thinking about directorially, how could I do this? Well, then I go so the writer's hat, director's hat, producer's hat comes on. The producer's hat says, how can I do this cheaply? Well, right there, producer's hat undermines the writing of the project, because now all of a sudden you're hobbling yourself. How can I do this cheaply? I'm still writing the script. Well, I can make it cheaply if I write a cheap script. So that starts to affect and impact the development of what I'm doing. What I realized with this was I could totally love seeing somebody recreate the Pike using the latest and greatest special effects. So, you know, get the roller coaster, the Ferris wheel, and there's Catalina out there on the ocean and this pier and just all that stuff. So when I realized that I was going to hobble what I was writing, I just said, I can't do that. I'm going to write this as a novel, even though I've never written a novel. And when it's done, if somebody should want to adapt it into a screenplay, great. And maybe that would be me, but somebody else has to decide to make this film, because I don't want that to affect this. I want to have this be pure and write it without any kind of interference from those parts of my brain that are going to try and get me to change it for economic reasons. I want this to just be whatever it's going to be. So that's why I did it that way. Okay, I want the readers to have fun. I want people who read this book to have a good time. I want them to feel like they're on a ride, to be curious about what happened and maybe thinking about who done it, although that's not really important. I want them to, I would like them to appreciate the time and the work that I put into doing it. That's really it. This is not a great work of literature. Maybe one of these days I'll write something that is, but this was my first novel. That's all. This is how I learned how to write a novel. That's it. We've moved into this era of self-publishing where a writer can write a book, get some cover art, upload it, and do print on demand, and they're a published novelist. There's a good side and a bad side to that. You know, anybody can do it. So it's a double-edged sword. In my case, I did it myself without a publisher because I didn't have an agent, I didn't have a publisher, and it was like, here's a way I can get the book out. I did a lot of research into doing that, and I discovered that, you know, agents these days and publishing companies, they're looking at authors to take on more and more of the responsibility of promoting their books. And as a part of that, I thought, well, okay, if that's what they're looking for, if I publish this book myself and promote it, that demonstrates that to them. A, my willingness to do it. B, my ability to do it. I am learning as I go every day. And I'll tell you something, it's not easy. I don't recommend this to the faint of heart. You know, every day I learn something new. Using social media to promote. You know, do I advertise? Do I buy ad space on Facebook? What do I do? Do I pay for a review in Kirkus? You know, I'm learning that you do that. People pay for reviews. That blew my mind. It's all about selling this thing. And really, in a way, for me, I've gotten a lot out of this process personally because you're investing in yourself. Which, you know, I feel pretty good about the fact that I've written this novel. And when I look at, which I have been doing lately, looking at the amount of money that I spent to do it and to promote it and to try and get it out there. I mean, this is not a money-making proposition yet by any means. It's hard. It is really hard. And then doing the events. I do author events at libraries, different places, you know, bookstores. I do writing workshops now, which has been very interesting. It's just another tool. The storytelling events, the whole thing started, the whole thing started with me selling the book and doing the storytelling events to sell the book. So much of my life has become about promoting the book. You have to really think about this. If this is something you're interested in, you really have to know going in, I'm willing to do the work because there's a lot of work. The sequel to the sequel to Persistence of Vision, which has no title yet, it came about while I was writing the first draft of Persistence of Vision, I was ride sharing with the guy I worked with, and he picked me up every day, and that's when I wrote, was right before I'd go get in the car with him. So every morning I would get in the car and he would hear what I'd been up to. So one morning I got in his car, I went to get in the car, and there was a document on the seat, passenger seat, and I said, "What's this?" And he said, that's the subject of your next book. Okay. So I start looking at this document, and what it is, it was a magazine article that told the story of the bonus march, which I had never heard. And as I read, I became incensed. The story, and this is not a story, this is not fiction, this actually happened. In World War I, soldiers who volunteered were given a bonus, and the bonus was a contractual stipulation that said at some point in the future, and I said they had determined what that point was, but it was like 1933, that the men who fought for the AEF would be given a bonus. Well, what happened in 29 in the fall with the crash created a need on the part of many of the veterans to get some kind of an assist from the government. And so they appealed to the federal government and the Congress to pay their bonus early, or part of it. Congress voted no. And the veterans marched on Washington, D.C. They marched, they built a tent city on the perimeter, they occupied it, and that tent city was nicknamed Hooverville, which didn't sit well with the president, as every subsequent tent city was named Hooverville as a result. Hoover decided he didn't like what was going on, and he decided to use his powers as the president. He commanded the military, led by Douglas MacArthur, to rout these veterans and their families. Remember, these aren't just the soldiers that fought in World War I. These are their wives and children as well. And so MacArthur went in with tanks and horses, infantry. They burned the tent city, burned possessions of these soldiers. And when I read this, I was so stunned that this had happened in our country. And then I thought, well, you know, today it kind of feels like that's not that surprising. So I'm going to use this as the backstory for my next book. And I, again, didn't know how. I mean, at that point, I really didn't, barely knew what I was doing. But I sort of had that going in background while I was writing Persistence of Vision. The difference here is going to be that the new book will take place on the East Coast. Moretti is going to revisit his family for the first time in years. He hasn't seen them since he was a child, so he's going to go meet his adult sister and adult brother and their families. His mother's still alive. He's going to meet his mother again for the first time in a long time. His father's dead, which, is part of the story behind Persistence of Vision. So, he doesn't have that. But he's reconnecting with his roots in this. And that's in New York. Then they go down to Washington, D.C. for him to participate in the bonus march. And things happen. Not just involved with the bonus march, but with his family, because now he's married and has a child. So I'm bringing characters from the first book into the second book. I'm introducing some new ones. He's going to be rubbing elbows with people from the world of surreal and Dada art, as opposed to Hollywood. And I really can't tell you more than that at this point because I don't know myself. I never intended on writing a series when I started. Really, that second book, the suggestion from my colleague when he presented me with that magazine article, I could have just read it and thought about it and put it in a drawer. But I realized the same way that I wrote the first book, that I don't need to know what happens. If I write this the same way, which I'm doing, I've gotten 5 chapters written so far, I just start and it goes, and things come out. And in some cases, they surprise me. And I have to tell you, that's really fun. When what you're writing surprises you, I guess it also makes you feel like you're a little maybe schizophrenic. It's like someone else is writing it, but it's fun. But also, beyond being fun, in this case, I think this is dealing with a really serious subject. The first book doesn't really have that, and so the second book is going to be distinguished because of that backstory. The third book, which I already have in mind, I say third book in that it's the third one that I have, in my head. I don't know, there may be others, but I'm not trying to make this a series. And I don't want to make it be something if it's not. The second book, though, has already demonstrated to me the same quality of the writing process as the first book. Sitting down, saying, okay, start. I'm not sure where it ended up. What do I do? Just keep writing. Keep writing. It's gonna go somewhere. You may not know where, but it's gonna go somewhere. And as long as it's fun and interesting, I'm gonna go there. This is what I tell them. If you want to be a writer, write. Two kinds of people in the world: people who want to write and people who write. The last workshop I did on screenwriting, I had a guy in the class who he clearly had experience that would lend itself to some writing project. I don't know what, but he'd been through some stuff, and he kept talking to me about why he couldn't. And I just finally told him, I said, look, do you want to write? Or are you a writer? Because what I'm hearing from you is you want to write. So anybody can want to write. You need to sit down and overcome whatever it is that's keeping you from doing it. It's not an easy thing for some people. Sitting quietly by yourself is not something, we're social, right? But I could write in a sports bar with 20 big screen TVs playing 20 football games and people screaming and yelling because I don't care about sports. I can sit there with that as background noise and I can write. And that kind of solves the problem of being solitary, right? It's not me sitting in a room by myself writing. I've written on airplanes, in airports, in bars, restaurants, bus benches, whatever. Just everywhere I could possibly write, I find a way to write. And I think partly because I have a dual personality in that I have a desire to be with people part of the time and a desire to be by myself part of the time. And that's kind of important. If you're not somebody who's willing to spend time with yourself, and writing is not for you. It really isn't, because it means not just spending time by yourself, but spending time with yourself. Because you need to think, you need to look in your mind, and I look at what I've been through in my life, and that's the fuel for what I do, for creative projects, whether it be a multimedia art piece or a film or a book. If I may, I want to thank my parents. They encouraged me. They told me I'm the writer in the family, although I'm not necessarily sure I believe that. I've read a couple of things my brother's written lately, and he's got some skills too. My father, actually, I found a bunch of stuff my father had written. I didn't know he had been journaling, and I was astonished by his ability to describe things. He was a math guy. My dad was a computer programmer for McDonnell Douglas. My parents, they believed in me, and they provided me with opportunities to explore myself creatively. That I would not be where I am if it wasn't for them.